want to thank the library's Nautical Advisory Council for their generous support of today's program. And all of our advisory councils are sponsored by are funded by the Library Foundation. So, again, to get to today's program, I have known today's presenter her entire life. And it's not a coincidence that we share the same last name. So before I give you some background about Julia, I want to proudly let you know that Julia is my daughter and that I'm very proud to be introducing her today. Julia has been fascinated with the natural world and always very curious since she was very young. And she's currently fulfilling her dreams of being a scientist, learning about the many wonders of the earth and sharing her knowledge with others. And we are very fortunate to have her joining us today. Julia Zay is a PhD candidate at Syracuse University, where she is a National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellow, studying behavior and acoustic communication in large whales. She is pursuing her PhD in the Bioacoustics and Behavioral Ecology Lab at Syracuse University with Dr. Susan Parks. In addition to doing research in the New York Bight, Julia's research has taken her to field sites in Massachusetts, Brazil, and Hawaii. Julia has been awarded a number of grants to support her research, including the Society for Marine Mammalogy's Lewis M. Herman Scholarship, the Animal Behavior Science Society's Student Research Grant, and the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology's Fellowship for Graduate Student Travel. Julia graduated from Schreiber High School right here in Port Washington in 2014 and received her BA from Columbia University in 2018. In addition to her research, Julia is active in science communication and outreach, and was recently awarded the Kevin Van Doren Outstanding Science Communicator Award at Syracuse University. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Julia Zay.
All right, hi everyone, and thank you so much for that introduction. I am very excited to tell you guys today about some of the incredible wildlife that we have not too far from where we are right now. This is going to give you sort of an overview of some information about some of the whales that we have here in New York, touch on a little bit of my research as well. And I am in the Bioacoustics and Behavioral Ecology Lab, and I am very interested in acoustic communication. And so there's going to be a lot of fun sounds for you to hear today. And to get started, I'm going to play you one of those sounds. So I'm not sure if any of you have heard a sound like this before, if you kind of guessed what it is, but this is a humpback whale singing, and this is actually a recording that was made right south of Long Island, pretty far south, but here in the New York area waters, and that is a humpback whale singing. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about some of the different sounds they make, but I just wanted to start off with giving you that taste of some of the whale sounds that we hear here in New York. So I'm going to start off, you're going to have to bear with me as I start with some pretty basic information. I just wanted to start with talking about what a whale is, because I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff about whales and about whale diversity that I really wanted to get started with. So first off, this is a picture showing some of the whale species of the world. You can see there's a really wide diversity of size, shape, color, and they are all over the world's oceans. And here I'm showing you a phylogenetic tree, which shows the evolutionary relationships of different whales, of different species. And I'm showing this to you because I want you to notice that the whales are up here. The whales and dolphins collectively are known as cetaceans. And then they're shown in this tree with their closest living relatives. So the closest living relatives of cetaceans are actually hippos. And then their other closest living relatives are the other hoofed mammals like deer and antelopes, pigs, and camels. So the most recent common ancestor of all of these was an artiodactyl, which is a hoofed animal. And whales are mammals, which means that they need to be able to come to the surface to breathe. So they breathe air, they can't breathe underwater. So like this fin whale here in the video, the whales can dive down deep, but they have to come back up to the surface in order to breathe. And you may have seen that that sort of puff that is the exhalation of the whale, that is known as a blow or a spout. And that's when the whales come to the surface to breathe. And some of the whales have slightly different shaped blows, so you can actually use that to identify which whale you're seeing from further away. This is a pair of humpback whales, a mom and a calf. So again, since whales are mammals, they give live birth and they nurse their young. This is a relatively recently born calf here. And whales have a variety of adaptations for life underwater. So again, they evolved from land mammals and then re-inhabited the aquatic ecosystem. And so they're able to dive really deep. They have adaptations for swimming. They can hold their breath a really long time and then come back to the surface. And they keep warm underwater. And because sound travels much faster in water than it does in air, they rely a lot on acoustic communication. So it's hard to see underwater, as many of you might know if you have gone swimming, especially here in the Atlantic where it's not the most clear water. And these are really big animals that travel really long distances and communicate with each other from long distances away. And so sound is really important for them for a variety of reasons, from social behavior to finding a mate, to talking to their young, for finding food. So there's really a lot of ways that they use sound. And this also means that for scientists, sound is a really great way for us to study them. We can understand their behavior by understanding how they communicate, but also we can monitor them by passively listening, by putting out recorders like hydrophones, which are underwater microphones, out in the ocean and listening to the types of sounds that we hear. So there are two main groups of whales, the baleen whales and the toothed whales. So this is another example of a humpback whale here, and you can see the baleen, this hair-like structure in their mouth. And this is common amongst all the baleen whales, and they use this to filter feed. So they take a big gulp of their prey, whether that's plankton or fish, and then they close their mouth in order to filter the water back out. And this allows them to gulp huge amounts of their prey while they're feeding. Some other things about the baleen whales is they're, in general, they're pretty big whales. So that includes a lot of the ones you may know, like the blue whale, fin whale, humpback whale. They have two blowholes on the top, like two nostrils on the top of their head. And they, in general, produce lower frequency or lower pitch sounds. And they often use these to communicate over longer distances. So back to this picture, these are examples of the baleen whale species. So we have blue whale, fin whale, we have sei whale, minke whale, gray whale, right whale, humpback whale, and I'll go into some more detail about some of these. And then we also have toothed whales. So this includes dolphins and porpoises, as well as beaked whales and the sperm whale. And as you can see in this picture, they have teeth. So different from the baleen whales that filter feed, these whales actually have teeth. They have only one blowhole, one nostril at the top of their head. They're generally smaller than the baleen whales. They don't migrate as far, although with some of these species, there's a lot that we still don't know about them. And so they have these tight social groups in certain areas. And something else really interesting about the toothed whales is that they use higher frequency or higher pitch sounds to communicate. And then they also use these high frequency sounds for echolocation or biosonar. So they can use their sounds and send out signals and then listen to what they hear back in order to get an idea of what's around them, whether that's the environment or navigation or finding prey. So these are examples of the wide variety of toothed whales, which, like I said, includes the beaked whales, which are down here, pilot whales, dolphins and porpoises, orca, beluga, narwhal, and the biggest, the sperm whale. Okay, so the next thing that I want to cover, now that we're all aware what whales are, is what the New York Bight is, because that is the region of interest for us today, the body of water that we're so close to. So this map I wanted to show you in part because the bathymetry, or these contours of the seafloor, are really interesting, because what you'll notice here is this is the Hudson River, and then after reaching the ocean, the Hudson River continues into the Hudson Canyon. And so the Hudson Canyon is this deeper part here that goes all the way out towards the continental shelf break. And the New York Bight is this area, this open bay formed by Long Island and New Jersey. So you can see it better here in this picture. And of course, as we're all very aware, New York City is right there at the point of the New York Bight, and it's one of the busiest ports in the world. And here in these shaded areas, we have the shipping lanes coming into that port. And so these are some really busy shipping lanes. There's a lot of activity going on in the New York Bight, which is why it's particularly interesting to understand what's going on with wildlife in this area, as well as what's going on with human activity and how the two interact. Something else interesting about this area that you may have heard about in the news recently is a lot of the offshore wind development that's going to be going on soon, and some of which is starting already. And so this white area is showing parts of the area that are going to be used for offshore wind development, which is great that we have some renewable energy coming, but also the construction of those wind farms and the operation, we don't really know entirely how those are going to affect all of the different wildlife that we have right here off New York. And so that's a really important area of research, is to figure out how again those human activities and the wildlife are going to interact. Some other really cool stuff about this area, we have a lot of diversity of seals, sea turtles, fish, and there are even deep water corals out here. So you may not have thought that there were corals anywhere but the tropical clear waters, but they're here as well. All right, so now I want to talk to you about the whales that live in New York. And these images show all of the different whale species that have been seen in the New York Bight. Some can be seen from the South Shore, from the beaches even. Sometimes people can see these whales. Others, you have to go on a boat farther out towards that continental shelf break in order to see them. So I'm going to go through each of them one by one and tell you a little bit about them. So the first is the humpback whale. Humpbacks are probably the most well-known whale because they're the ones you often see pictures of as they're breaching, jumping out of the water, slapping their tails, slapping their peck fins, and they're the ones that make this song that so many people are familiar with from records of humpback whale song and other pop culture references to humpback whale song. And so I'm going to play you another clip of humpback whale song. But first I want to orient you to what this image over here is. So this is called a spectrogram, and it's a way that we visually represent sound so that it can aid in our analysis. So oftentimes as a bioacoustician, I spend time both looking at the spectrogram as well as listening. And so on the y-axis, we have frequency, which, like I said before, is the pitch. So over here, the highest on this y-axis is 5 kilohertz, and the lowest is 0 kilohertz. And then on the x-axis, we have time. And then the color shading is showing you how loud a sound is. So I'm going to play a sound, and hopefully you can kind of follow along, a bit like reading music, where the loud sounds are as I play through. So you'll read it from left to right as I play through this sound. So that's an example of some humpback whale song. And humpback whales make a wide diversity of sounds. So as far as we know, only the males sing, But the females and juveniles and calves also make sounds to communicate, and these are known as calls or social calls. And a lot of these are units that make up the song. So each of these individual sounds that you heard kind of separated by quiet between them, each of those is a unit, and sometimes those are also used in social contexts on their own. Whereas song tends to be louder, it occurs in this patterned sequence, which is really interesting, and it occurs mostly on the breeding grounds. Next is the North Atlantic right whale, and the North Atlantic right whale is the most endangered large species of whale. So in this species, there are only less than 400 left in the whole entire world, and they're sometimes called the urban whale because their habitat really occupies the eastern seaboard of the United States. And so they're threatened by a number of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But they're really amazing animals. And I'm going to play you a clip. Here's another image of a North Atlantic right whale and another spectrogram. This is a right whale upcall, and this is what's often used for monitoring right whales. And so again, you have frequency on the y-axis. This time the y-axis only goes up to about 1 kilohertz. So these are lower frequency sounds, and you'll notice they're lower pitch. And then time again is on the x-axis, and you'll hear 4 different upcalls. So these upcalls are contact calls, which means they use them to communicate amongst each other, to show that they're there, like, hey, I'm over here. But there's still, again, a lot that we don't totally understand about the calls of these whales and how they communicate. Next up, we have the fin whale, which is the second largest species of whale. And you can find these right here in New York too. Here's a picture of 3 of them feeding. And fin whales make these low frequency pulses that I'm going to play for you here, these 20 hertz pulses, which are also called song. They're a much simpler repetitive sequence of the same or a couple of notes over and over again. And this sound is at 20 hertz, and 20 hertz is really below or just at the edge of human hearing range. So this sound has been sped up 5 times in order for you to hear it. So it's going to be faster than the actual sound is, and by speeding it up, that also makes the pitch higher so that it's in our hearing range. Something that's really amazing about these low frequency sounds is low frequency, low pitch means it also has a really long wavelength. And so these sounds can travel really far in the ocean, whereas high frequency sounds, which have this small wavelength, lose energy really quickly, whereas the low frequency sounds don't. And so these sounds can travel across ocean basins depending on the other environmental characteristics. And so it's really amazing how far away we can hear some of these animals and how far potentially they're communicating with each other. Next up, I have the sei whale. And I think a lot of people don't know anything about sei whales. I just saw some for the first time. I had the opportunity to go out and tag some sei whales, and they are very fast and sleek, and they're also very big. And they can be found here in New York as well. Here's a picture of one feeding again. For most of these whales, the northern or the higher latitudes are where they're feeding, including New York, whether that's its own feeding ground or a stopover point on their migration. And sei whales make these down sweeps that I'm going to play for you here. And there's still a lot that we don't know about sei whales, which is really exciting that there's still so much to learn. And the fact that there's these huge animals right here that we still don't totally understand, where do they go at different times of the year? What's their migration like? Where do they give birth? What kind of sounds do they make to communicate? What's their social structure like? There's a lot of research still to be done on these animals. Next up, we have minke whales, which are smaller of the baleen whales. And here's an example of a minke whale. So sometimes you might even see them and think it was a dolphin because they're so much smaller than, say, the humpback or the fin whale or that you might see out here. And minke whales make this sound called a pulse train. So this is going to sound a little bit different from some of these down and up sweeps that you've been hearing. So that's a minke whale pulse train. And for a lot of these animals that I'm showing you, they make a variety of different sounds. And I'm just giving you one example of a call type that they make, just to give you a little taste. So minke whales also make some interesting sounds like a boing sound and what's called a Star Wars sound. So I encourage you to look those up afterwards if you're interested. The final baleen whale that we have here in New York waters is the blue whale, the biggest animal to ever live on Earth. And these really big whales, as you might be able to guess, make really big calls. So these again have really long wavelengths, really long sound waves that they produce and are really low frequency. So here's an image of a blue whale. And then I'm going to play you, and this is going to be probably the hardest one for you to hear their sound because it's so low frequency. So this is a down sweep, and here you can see this is about 50 hertz. And so again, below what we can really hear, and so it's been sped up. This one has been sped up 3 times in order for us to hear. They also make their calls very slowly, so their sequences are long and slow. And the other thing you might notice here is as we get to these lower frequencies, there's also a lot more background noise. So this kind of blue fuzz in the spectrogram. These recordings aren't that noisy, but that low frequency, that low pitch is where a lot of, say, wave noise, water movement, wind, rain, all of that is, as well as a lot of the sounds that humans make. So whether that's boat noise or other human activities in the water. So I'm going to play you this. Hopefully you can kind of, with the spectrogram, notice where those down sweeps are, but don't worry if you can't. Okay, next on to the toothed whales that you can find in New York. And some of these can be found close to shore, but a lot of them are deep divers who are found further from shore in deeper waters, including the sperm whale. So the sperm whale is a toothed whale, and it uses echolocation, and it also uses clicks to communicate. It's got this really big nose because it uses that as part of its acoustic communication system. So it produces sounds in there, and it has a number of different fat pockets to focus the sounds. They have some very, very cool anatomy for making their sounds. And this is what a sperm whale looks like from above. And I'm going to play you some of their clicks, which are also sometimes known as codas, that they use to communicate. Bottlenose dolphins are maybe one of the cetaceans you're most likely to have seen, aside from humpback whales. There are bottlenose dolphins very close to shore on the south shore of Long Island, and you'll often see them if you go out on a boat. They like to bow. A lot of dolphins like to bow ride, which means they'll come and swim alongside your boat and kind of play in the waves that your boat is making. And Dolphins make very high frequency sounds. So like I mentioned, they can make these buzzes and clicks, some of which are used for echolocation. And then they also make these whistles, these high frequency whistles that they use to communicate. Something really interesting about dolphins in general and bottlenose dolphins specifically is they have something called a signature whistle, which is almost like a name for each individual dolphin. So different dolphins have different signature whistles, and they'll use that in communication with others. They'll kind of maybe say what their signature whistle is, but then also if they're trying to get in contact with each other, another one might use that one's signature whistle. So there's a lot of really cool work being done on how those whistles are used, how they develop, all sorts of things. So here's an example of some dolphin vocalizations. So, and again, just to emphasize the difference in the pitch, you can see the y-axis here. This time, the y-axis is going up to 65 kilohertz, whereas below, we were below 1 kilohertz. 1 kilohertz is 1,000 hertz. So this is 65,000 hertz is the top of this y-axis, versus some of the ones I showed you before, the top was 100 hertz. So a big difference. The short-beaked common dolphin is the other dolphin species that you might see around here. And again, they also make these high-frequency whistles, as well as clicks and buzzes. And often you'll see these animals in large groups called pods. So you'll see pods of dolphins. The Rizzo's dolphin is one that you'll see much further offshore. You're not likely to see this one close to land. And they make some other really interesting noises. And again, some of these, especially these deep diving toothed whales, we know a lot less about, and there's a lot still to understand about them. The short-finned pilot whale is another one of those species that lives in deeper waters as a deep diver. And this is an example of a pilot whale vocalization. And lastly, we have the harbor porpoise, which is a very small cetacean. And I'm going to play you some of the clicks that the harbor porpoise makes. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a taste of the variety of sounds that marine mammals make, and the variety of sounds that we can hear out in the waters, not too far away from where we're sitting right now. And as well as the difference between the baleen whales and the toothed whales and the variety of sounds that they make. And for the rest of my talk, I'm really going to focus a lot more on the baleen whales because that's my area of expertise and where my research is. But there are also these toothed whales in the area here as well, and a lot of really interesting research on them. Okay, so next I want to talk about why New York. So this humpback whale here is lunging not too far from the New York City skyline. But given that we know this is such an urban area, such a busy port, what are they doing here? Why are they coming here? And so I mentioned before that a lot of these whales migrate. And so we know the migration of the North Atlantic right whale, which is on the left, and the humpback whale on the right really well. And so, like I said, the North Atlantic right whale is really migrating up and down the east coast of the US. They migrate, like a lot of these baleen whales, they migrate between feeding grounds and breeding grounds. So the breeding grounds of the North Atlantic right whale are in the southeast US. This is where they give birth to their calves and start nursing them when they're very young. And then they migrate up north to the Gulf of Maine and farther north to Canada. This map, even more recently, they've been seen even farther north in Canada. And these are the areas where they feed. They feed mostly on zooplankton, on copepods. And this habitat that they use makes them especially vulnerable to different human activities. So you can see that they're really living, migrating, feeding right in the areas where there's a lot of really busy human activity going on. And there also have been impacts of climate change on these whales. The biggest impact is really what's happening to their prey. So as changes happen in the ocean ecosystem, the changes in the plankton and the fish, they will move what habitats they're in, and that will cause the whales to move as they're following the food. And then for humpback whales over here, they also migrate between breeding and feeding grounds. So a lot of these migrate to the Caribbean to give birth and nurse their young. And that's where they are in winter. For both of these whales, they spend winter on the southern breeding grounds. And then they spend their summers in these higher latitude feeding grounds where they're eating. And that again includes the Gulf of Maine and Canada, but also up into Iceland and over in Northern Europe as well. They segregate into these different feeding populations. And so for both of these, the main reason that they're migrating north is for food. So this picture was taken again off of Long Island, and you can see large container ships in the background. And these two whales are lunge feeding on Atlantic menhaden, which is also known locally as bunker. So you might have seen bunker before. This is what an individual fish looks like, but you may also have seen it as these bait balls or fish boils on the water. And so they're these massive schools of fish. And in recent years, the menhaden population has really grown a lot and come back. And that's part of the thinking for why we're seeing so many more whales, humpback whales in particular, in areas around New York. And so if you go out on a whale watch and you see a lot of these fish boils, you're probably more likely to see some whales feeding. And whales have a lot of really interesting methods of feeding. Around here, most of what you'll see is lunge feeding, which is like this picture here, where they're coming up into the school and lunging into a big pot of fish and gulping them down. I also just want to mention real quick while I'm looking at this picture that the photos in this presentation are all taken under research permits from research vessels. And all of these animals are federally protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And it is illegal to get within 100 yards of them. So just keep that in mind in case you're out on a boat. If the whale comes to you, that's okay, it's not your fault, but don't get within 100 yards of one of these animals. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about this, but I want to get even more specific in what sort of threats whales face in New York Bight and other similar areas, especially along the eastern United States. But I also don't just want to talk about all of these bad things that the whales are facing. I want to talk a little bit about some of the solutions that scientists and policymakers have come up to help protect these whales. And in particular, this is going to focus on the highly endangered North Atlantic right whale, which I mentioned before. There's less than 400 left in the world. And right whales spend a lot of time at the surface of the water. They sort of skim feed along the surface. Sometimes they also bottom feed. And this makes them really vulnerable to two things, entanglement in fishing gear in particular, as well as ship strikes. So I'm not going to show you a picture of a ship strike because a lot of those are pretty upsetting pictures, but you'll see a lot of whales with scarring, and it can either leave them with injury, which will impact them later in life, or it can lead to death if they're struck by a ship. Same with entanglement. It can lead to death sometimes, but there are also whales that drag around fishing gear for years, so that's really chronic stress that a lot of these whales are encountering. And so this right whale you can see has a bunch of lines attached to it, kind of tangled around its head and then also trailing behind it. And so there are a number of rescue teams out there, especially up here in the Northeast. There's teams that will go out and try and cut off the ropes from the whales. But as you can imagine, that's a pretty hard job. You have to make sure that you're keeping the whale safe and you safe when you're doing that. And this is sort of a chronic and ongoing issue with whales. One of the solutions that people have proposed is ropeless fishing. So a traditional rope and buoy looks like this one here that I'm circling, where you've got this, say it's a crab or lobster pot on the bottom, and then you have a line coming up to the top to let you know where that pot is and so that you can drag it up. One of the proposed solutions is to use new technology, including these pop-up buoys, inflatable lift bags, and buoyant spools. And these sound kind of cartoons are showing that the boat can send out an acoustic signal to these traps to let them know when to release. So when the trap hears that signal, it releases up to the top and will float up to the top to where it can be pulled in. And so this way you don't have these lines coming from the surface to the bottom, which are a really easy way for whales to get entangled. You can imagine with tons of these sort of traditional ropes and buoys, which I've seen tons and tons, kind of in every direction you look when you're out there during the right season. And it's amazing that more whales don't get entangled in them. Another thing that is really important as part of the protection of these whales is implementing slow zones where boats have to go at slower speeds in order to avoid hitting the whales. And so you don't need to see too many details of this map, but I wanted to show especially these yellow and red areas. And you can see Long Island's right here, we're right here. The red areas are annual seasonal management areas where large boats are required to slow down to 10 knots during the season when right whales are known to be in the area. And then these yellow areas are dynamic management areas. And the dynamic management areas occur when there have been right whales sighted or heard in the vicinity. And so once that happens, then the speed limit is introduced for these large ships to go slow. And so this will either be from visual observers out there looking for right whales, or a lot of we'll have different recorders with hydrophones set up in the water, transmitting back to shore so that in real time, scientists can be listening to hear whether they hear that up call that I played you before, because that's the contact call that's produced by both sexes and all ages. And once they hear those up calls, they know that there's right whales in the area and they can tell people to slow down. Lastly, I wanted to touch on the threat of anthropogenic noise, which anthropogenic means basically human activity, human caused, and all of the different sources of sound in the ocean. And so I think at one point, not too long ago, people really thought that the ocean was a silent world, but it's not. It is one that is full of a wide variety of different sounds. And so this graphic is showing you a lot of those different sources. So in this kind of white, light blue color, we've got these biological sounds made by different animals, from the cetaceans I talked about, to pinnipeds like seals, and fish, and even crustaceans like shrimp. If any of you have been to some more tropical places and gone snorkeling or scuba diving, you might hear this like crackling and popping sound when you go underwater, and those are actually snapping shrimp, making that incredibly loud noise that you'll hear. So if you go on vacation sometime soon, pay attention to that. Then we also have non-biological natural sounds like earthquakes and weather. Lightning makes the loudest sound in the ocean when it hits water. And like I said, rain and wind can also make a lot of sound. And then there's all of this sound from human activity. So a lot of fishing boats use pingers and echo sounders. So the echo sounders let them use, similar to the echolocation of the toothed whales, send out a signal and then listen to what comes back to figure out what's below them. So to find fish. Ships make a lot of noise with their engines running underwater. Seismic surveys, which are for a variety of reasons, whether that's surveying the sea floor, for mapping, or to figure out where construction is going to go on. And then different construction, whether it's for oil and gas rigs or more recently for wind farm development, also makes a lot of noise. They have to do these surveys of the area. And then they also have to actually do the construction. A lot of that involves pile driving, which makes a really loud sound as they're hammering things into the ground. And so there's the construction phase, and then there's also the actual operation, which can also cause different types of sound. And so I'm going to play for you the sound of a freighter recorded on a hydrophone. This one's from Alaska, was recorded by Chris Gabriel in Glacier Bay National Park. And so this is a freighter boat sound. You can imagine that being out in the ocean, that's, just one ship passing by, that you have that in certain places like New York all the time with lots and lots of variety of ships, from large ships to small recreational boats, which might zip on by an animal. You have propeller sounds underwater and large engine sounds. There's a wide variety. I also want to play for you this YouTube video shows, again, a spectrogram of air guns used for seismic surveys. And this says here that it was recorded thousands of kilometers away from the source. So this is thousands of kilometers away from where this sound is happening, and this is how loud it sounds. And this is sped up 10 times because, again, it's in the low frequency range that's hard for us to hear. So it's sped up 10 times for us to hear it better. But also, I want you to keep in mind that, again, I'm talking about this low frequency range where it's hard for us to hear and sounds that have been sped up. And you'll remember that I played other sounds like that, which were the blue whale and fin whale and some of the other baleen whale calls. So that means that with so much of this noise down here at the low frequency, that's where, they're focused on listening. These things can cause physical damage to the whales or to other marine organisms. They can cause ear damage, hearing damage, and they can also cause shifts in their hearing thresholds. And it can also just be a form of chronic stress and make it harder for them to communicate, say to find a mate or to socialize or find food. So here's that seismic survey air gun. Again, thousands of kilometers away from the source. So all this to say, the ocean is a very noisy place from biological, environmental, and human-made sounds. There's a whole lot going on that we don't hear because we're listening in the air instead of in water. And again, sound travels a lot faster and farther in water than it does in air. Okay, well, let me get to the next slide. Ooh. One moment. Okay, again, all of the different sounds in the ocean. And so, like I said before, this means that sound is really a really useful thing to study in the ocean. People have been using sound to study the ocean for decades now. There was a particularly big boom in acoustic studies around World War II, as there was submarine sonar and a variety of sounds being made in the ocean and listening being done in the ocean. And that was really when people started to hear these kind of weird sounds that they realized were coming from animals in the ocean. And so that's sort of when a lot of whale research started, and it was kind of 50s, 60s, 70s when people started to identify which whales these were coming from. And so this field that I'm in of marine bioacoustics really is not that old a field. It's really recent, and that's part of the reason that we have so much to learn. But with an increase in all of the different technology that's available, it's a lot easier to actually go out and do studies. So in this picture, I'm showing you the wide variety of ways that we can study whales and other marine animals using sound. So on the left here, we have a buoy with a recorder, and sometimes these buoys have satellite transmission capability. So like I said, with the right whale call being transmitted in real time so that an alert can be sent out to ships to slow down. There are these buoys out there. There's some even in New York Bight, but there's a lot, particularly in Boston Harbor and the Stellwagen Bank Sanctuary area. And these can be sometimes transmitting in real time the sounds that they're recording. There can also be towed hydrophones, and again, a hydrophone is an underwater microphone. So being towed from, say, an autonomous vehicle or from a boat can be, a hydrophone can be dipped over the side of a boat. There are gliders, so there are autonomous glider robots that are out in the ocean going up and down in the water column that have hydrophones on them and sometimes also other sensors. Again, here we have a floating buoy. Here we have a pinger and a fish, so sometimes fish tags can be put on that will emit sound in order to track where the fish are. There are moored hydrophones like these, and a lot of these are getting cheaper and cheaper and easier to get. And so all around the world, there's more and more marine bioacoustic studies being done. And a lot of these species that I showed you that are here in New York are also found all over the world, which is really interesting. How did they end up in so many different diverse places? And so now there's a lot more capability to study them in all of these different places. The last one on here I'm going to talk a little bit more about. This is an acoustic recording tag. This one specifically is a suction cup tag with hydrophones so that it can go on the whale and we can get on the whale data. So next I want to tell you a little bit about an example of one of these ways that we can use acoustics to study whales here in New York. So this is a paper that I published in 2020. This was part of my undergraduate senior thesis work with the Wildlife Conservation Society, with my co-authors listed here, that we published in Marine Mammal Science. And in this paper, we used data that had been collected in 2008 and 2009, which was really the first acoustic, planned acoustic major survey of whales in New York. And so they used these yellow recorders that Cornell makes, which are called Marine Autonomous Recording Units, or MARUs, also known as pop-ups, because they pop up for you to be able to collect them. These are archival as opposed to real time. So those are sort of the differences in what we call passive acoustic monitoring. That's this idea that we're just passively listening for what's in the environment. Rather than sending out sound to survey things, we're just recording sound to hear what's out there. So this is called passive acoustic monitoring, sometimes abbreviated as PAM. And it can be divided into real time, like I said, where it's being transmitted via satellite, so we know what's going on at almost exactly the time it's happening. Or it can be archival, which is where it's being recorded on the sensor and we have to go pick it up in order to get the data back. Which makes it really important to be able to find these things and recover them again, because otherwise you're out, you have no data to analyze. So this is an example of what they look like. This is one being deployed, and this is one being recovered. And so the team at Cornell, in what was then called the Bioacoustics Research Program, and is now called the Center for Conservation Bioacoustics, they put in a contract with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. They put out these recorders in New York, and they put them out going south from Long Island, and they had 3 closer to New York Harbor, and they listened for different whales. And so they published a report that was publicly available about the target species of baleen whales, most of the ones that I showed you in the beginning, and looked at the detections of calls that they were getting on these recorders, and what time of year they were getting different species and where they were getting different species. And one thing that they didn't do was they didn't look really at humpback whales. They did kind of a quick look for when they were looking for other whales and they came across humpback whales, but they didn't do a very thorough analysis for humpback whales in particular. And so that's where my research came in, was I wanted to do a more thorough look at the presence of different humpback whale vocalizations in New York waters. And so this map is showing, again, the New York Bight. You have the shipping lanes here, and this is one of the recorders that was in this array of recorders that they put out. This one was close to the shelf break, so a little further out. And I looked at just this one recorder for my research. And this is the sound sample that I played for you at the very beginning. This is a recording of Humpback Whale's song that was recorded in January 2009 at that location south of Long Island that I showed you. And I'm going to play it for you again now with this spectrogram, now that you know what a spectrogram is and how to read it. This one, again, has frequency on the y-axis with 1,000 hertz or 1 kilohertz as the highest point on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And the other thing, and hopefully you can see it, but there's a green line here that's going to move across the screen as I play it to help you see where we are in the sound and help you read that. Basically, I went through hours and hours of data looking for evidence of both humpback whale songs, so these patterned sequences, which are a lot easier to find in the spectrograms, as well as calls, which can kind of be one-off sounds. And so that was tricky. And I'll play the sound and then tell you a little bit more about how we make that a little bit easier to do. So hopefully you can see the green line. So in doing this, since we had hundreds of hours of data recorded from 2008 into 2009, which would have taken a very long time to look at all the spectrograms for or to listen through the whole thing. Instead, what I did was I used an automated detection algorithm, which looks for, is a computer science programming tool to look through the audio recording and pull out the sounds that it thinks are of interest based on what we tell it is of interest. And so in this case, I used a humpback whale specific detection algorithm. But then what I had to do, because the algorithm doesn't always get things right, is I had to go through and mark whether those were actually humpback whale sounds. And in an environment like this, you can see a lot of this red stuff on the bottom. There is a lot of noise in New York. And so that makes it even harder to detect and to use an automated detector to pick out the signal that we're interested in amongst all of the noise. And so I manually went through all of the detections that it gave me. And if it was not a humpback whale call, I discarded those and just kept the ones that were humpback whales. And then I put everything all together and looked at just hours of the day that had at least one humpback whale vocalization. Again, both song and calls I looked at, because if you look at only song, you're only knowing about male presence because the females and also some of the younger individuals don't sing. And also, something else interesting to note, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is I'm talking about being here in New York on the feeding ground. And I mentioned before that a lot of the song is occurring on the breeding ground where they're finding a mate, they're giving birth. And so it's really interesting that we're recording song right here in New York. And there has been evidence that song is produced sometimes on the feeding grounds and on migration as well. But this was sort of the first evidence that there is song going on here in New York Bight. And so this was the main result of the research that I did. I'll start first with this top graph. This is showing the number of hours per day. So out of 24 hours in a day, how many of those hours had at least one vocalization from a humpback whale? And so days with these higher black peaks had like more of the day had humpback whale song. And some of these days you can see had no hours with humpback whale song for long periods. This gray shaded area is when unfortunately we don't have any recordings. This was due to, because these recorders would go out and then would have to come back. The data would have to be downloaded. They would have to, make sure that the recording equipment was all okay before putting it back out. They can't be out for more than, say, a few months. And so unfortunately, in the summer, there was an issue with the recorders and they couldn't get them back out for the summer. But the summer is when we have a lot of whale watching and, recreational boaters out. And so that's actually when we have the most visual data about when humpback whales are in the area. And what we know is that the people are seeing a lot of humpback whales in the area in summer. That's really the best time to go whale watching, which makes sense because summer is the feeding season. But the highest peaks that I got in my song recordings were in winter and spring, which is really interesting because those are times when we expect them to be migrating or to be already on the breeding ground. And so this, brings up a lot of questions of why is there so much song going on? Why are there so many singing whales here in New York? And why are they here at different times? Are some of them not migrating to the breeding ground? Are they sticking around here? Are they, could it be younger individuals that are sticking around to eat more before going to find a mate because they're not big and strong enough yet for the migration? And all of these are sort of speculatory questions that we don't know the answers to. From the data that I'm showing you here alone, all we know is there was at least one whale present at the time. And we don't even know it was right on top of the recorder. It was somewhere within the vicinity where we can hear that sound. And so passive acoustic monitoring is this really amazing tool because I've got this really long-term data set at times of the year when it would be really hard to go out on a boat and look for whales. So in winter, it's not the most fun to be out on a boat surveying for whales, but we can have an acoustic recorder out there surveying for us. But the two are really complementary. We kind of need both. Without the visual surveys, we don't know how many whales, we don't know what they were doing necessarily. But also without the acoustic surveys, you're really only getting a snapshot of when you were able to go out and do your visual surveys. So going forward, I think one thing that we learned is how important it is to do both visual and acoustic surveys together. At the same time that we learned how valuable acoustic recordings are, because we see all of this humpback whale presence, acoustic presence in New York at times when we're not used to going out and surveying. The other thing with passive acoustics is that a whale could be there and it could just be quiet and we wouldn't know. So just because this is when the song was occurring doesn't mean there weren't whales here in the fall. They could have just been quiet. But that's really interesting from a behavioral standpoint too, is if they were here and they were quiet, which there are visual observations from whale watches of whales in the fall, why were they quiet? What are they doing? And then again here in panel B, that's just showing the calls, so these other non-song vocalizations. And there's a lot fewer, and in part that could be because these are quieter signals, and so they either got masked by noise or don't travel as far, so we didn't pick them up on the recorder. So I want to talk about a more recent study that's been done, because again, this was 2008, 2009 data that I used for this paper, and there has been some more recent work in New York. There's been a big push for research in New York, and there's a lot of different awesome organizations around this area doing a lot of research on whales in particular and other marine species in the New York Bight. But more recently, Cornell was contracted for another passive acoustic survey from the New York State DEC. And I was a part of this project. I contributed some analysis for this. And so this was sort of an updated version of what was done in 2008 and 2009. And these surveys were done from October 2017 to October 2020. And again, since this is a New York State funded project, all of these results are actually available online. This whole PDF is. And so this is a map from that report. And each of these red and yellow circles is showing a different acoustic recorder that was out there. There were different types of acoustic recorders. Again, in purple, we have the shipping areas. And this yellow is the New York offshore planning area for wind energy development, as I mentioned before. And so the goal of this project was to focus on a few different species of interest and learn about the spatial and seasonal distribution of when those whales can be detected acoustically. And at the same time, there were aerial surveys going on as part of a different New York State funded project, surveying from planes for different whale species. And I just want to give you a quick look at what the results of that study were, this acoustic study. So in this graph, each plot is showing a different species. So we've got blue whales on the top, then fin whales, humpback whales, North Atlantic right whales, and sei whales. The three different color lines are the three different survey years. So there were three years of acoustic recordings done. And then finally on the y-axis, we have proportion of days with detections. So a 1 would mean on all of the days there were detections of this animal on every single day of that month. Whereas a 0 means that on none of the days, and in the middle, say, would be 50% of the days. So on half of the days that the recorder was out there, there were whales detected. And then on the x-axis, we have months, so time of year. And the main takeaways that I want you to get from this graph are that for fin whales and humpback whales in particular, there were high proportions of detections of those whales throughout the entire year. So those species are really heard in New York, are calling in New York year round. And the same is really true for right whales, even though the proportion does go down, as well as sei whales. And then blue whales are the least frequently detected because they're probably further from shore and further from a lot of these recorders. Okay, so then I want to talk a little bit about my favorite tool for studying whales, because from reports like these, we still end up with a lot of questions. Like I said, with passive acoustic monitoring, we know that there was a whale calling, but that's sort of it. There's a push to be able to do more analysis where we can maybe do density estimation using acoustics and estimate how many whales were present. But as of right now, with our current capabilities, a lot of what we get is just detection of whale versus no detection of whale. And so in New York in particular, we have a lot of questions across all of these different species about what they're doing here. You know, what different sounds are they making? Are they feeding? Are they doing things other than feeding? Where are they? What times of year are they here? And what times of year are they doing different behaviors? And so one of the tools that we can use to get a lot more fine scale individual behavior data is tags. And so in the lab that I'm part of, we only use suction cup attached tags. There are tags that are implantable that are used by some groups, and those are usually used to track long distance migrations because they stay attached to the whale, but they can be invasive and they can cause damage to the whale sometimes. Most of the time they don't, but they can sometimes. Whereas the suction cups really are a non-invasive technique. They attach to the whale, and then in the span of a few hours to a few days, the tag pops off. These tags are archival, which again, if you remember when I talked about the other acoustic recordings, what that means is that the data is stored on the tag, and you have to go back out and get it in order to get your data. So we have to be able to track the tags after they fall off the whale somewhere in the ocean, these little tags, you know, about this big sometimes, on this crazy ocean scavenger hunt to find our data. These tags you can see in this one's called a D-tag, a digital acoustic recording tag. These bumps at the back are the hydrophones. Inside, it also has an accelerometer and magnetometer. So that's like you have a smart watch or a Fitbit that monitors your movement, or sometimes your phone tells you. We have that on a whale to see how it's moving and what different directions it's moving. And lastly, it also has this antenna at the top. And you can see over here, these are 3 different types of tags. They all would have antennas. And the antenna emits a VHF, or very high frequency signal, which we can then listen to with a radio receiver and an antenna and track the tag, both track the animal and then eventually to track the tag and get it back. These three different types of tags are a CATS tag, an AccuSonde, and a D-tag. The CATS tag is CAT stands for Customized Animal Tracking Services, and they more recently have some of these tags that have cameras on them. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of footage in a little bit of what that is like to see the world from the back of a whale. So one of the things you might be wondering, now that I mentioned these suction cup tags that are attached, is how the heck we put them on a whale. And so I'm going to show you this video, which comes from the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, which is part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, tagging a humpback whale in the Stellwagen National Marine Sanctuary. This is a group that I have been lucky enough to do some research with more recently. I was not part of this trip, but this project is still ongoing, and every summer we go out and tag humpback whales to learn more about them in Stellwagen. And so I'm gonna play this video, and what you'll see is this is the tagger, and he's holding a very long pole with a tag at the end. And the whale will come up, he puts the tag on the back of the whale, and the whale keeps swimming, and the boat goes away.
Now that's a placement.
Very nice. Woohoo!
That felt good.
That felt good.
That looked good. That. Don't let it go to his head.
You can see they're very happy here to have gotten a tag on, because although it looks sort of easy here, it is very challenging to get in the exact right position with the whale at the exact time that it's surfacing, and get that whale in exactly the right place. Because we want to get it, on the back of the whale. We don't want to hit the whale's head, and we want in an optimal position where it's also going to stay on for a longer period of time. And then we have to track using these antennas, the tags. And so this is a picture of me doing some radio tracking in Brazil. Here I'm doing tracking on land, but most of the time we're doing this on a boat in the water. This was because we were in the shallow bay and I was up on a high lookout. So we'll do that sometimes too, to get elevation, to be able to hear the tag and go find it. And then once we get the tags back, we're really excited, like you can see me in these pictures, because that means we have our data that we can analyze, and we get a look into what the life of a whale is like, which is really, really amazing. One of the things we get is the dive profile. So this, we get the pressure. There's a pressure sensor in the tag, and so that will tell us how deep the whale was at different points in time. So this is showing the depth in meters on the y-axis and time in minutes on the x-axis. And so this, you can see the track of the whale. So the whale dove down to almost 60 meters and then came back up to the surface. And this gives us an incredible insight into what's going on beneath the water, where we can't always be and we can't always see what they're doing. And then we get to combine this with the acoustic recording, so we can hear what they're saying or what they're hearing in the environment at the time that this is happening. And we also get an idea of the accelerometer and magnetometer, which show some more of the movement information. And sometimes we also have video. So this is an example from a paper that was published with some D-tags in Stellwagen National Marine Sanctuary. And so up here you have a dive profile of a whale again. And then down here, this is in a program called TrackPlot, which plots what the movement of that whale was like. And so with the accelerometer and magnetometer, we also get an idea of if the whale was rolling or turning. And so we can reconstruct what the path of that whale looked like. And so this gives us insight into, say, are they rolling on the bottom when they're foraging, when they're getting their food? At what point are they making calls, when they're at the bottom of their dive or the top of their dive? There's a lot of really interesting questions that we can ask and start to answer with these types of data. And then this is one of the last things I'm going to show you. This is a video from the Marine Mammal Research Program at the University of Hawaii, showing some footage from one of these CATS tags with videos. And they were looking at nursing behavior in humpback whales in Hawaii. So I'm just going to show you a couple minutes of this video.
Yes! Well done, well done, well done, well done.
So on the left you have footage from that tag on the back of the whale. On the right is the drone footage they took from the air. You can see the tag right here on the back of the calf. And in Hawaii, it's great because the water is so clear. We get a really amazing view of the whales underwater. So this is the calf rubbing up against mom. So I wanted to show you that just to give you a little taste for the absolutely incredible types of data that we get from these tags. It's really amazing. It's a lot of hard work that goes into putting these tags out, but then we get to see what the underworld life of these whales is like, it was really incredible. And so I wanted to end talking about just briefly that this is the field site that I am so lucky to work in as part of my dissertation research, where I have been tagging humpback whales with the goal of learning more about their vocal development, so how their vocalizations develop with age over time. And we're getting that information from using tags on individual whales. And so these are the West Maui Mountains in Maui, Hawaii, in part of the Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary. And so keep an eye out for that research as I'm working on it now, and hopefully it'll be out in the next few years. There will be lots of exciting news out of Hawaii. And so with that, I just want to close bringing it back to the incredible whales of New York, this diversity of species that hopefully you now know a little bit more about. You know a little bit more about what it sounds like just off the coast. Maybe you'll keep an eye out for whales next time you're out there. They do show up in the Long Island Sound sometimes too, as many of you might be aware, but more common on the South Shore in the ocean, of course. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions that anyone has. Thanks for your time.
So thank you so much, Julia. That was a terrific presentation, not just coming from your dad, but I have to say it was a great talk today. So I do want to get to some questions here. I just want to once again thank the Nautical Advisory Council for their generous support of today's programs. I know we have some questions here in the chat, but I think I just saw a hand over here.
Thank you for a great presentation. So I don't know whether it's the right whale or the sperm whale or whether they're the same thing, but the whale that you said is threatened and is now only 400.
The right whale.
Is that going up or down, that population?
Ooh, good question. It is at the moment going down. So they were hunted close to extinction during whaling, and they started to recover a bit from that, but it then started to go down again with all of those other threats that I talked about. About 10 years ago, it was starting to go up again, towards 500, but in more recent years has gone down again. So it is, at the moment, it is going down.
Thank you for such an informative talk. I had a question. Do they sound different when they are in distress or when they're happy or even the childbirth?
Yeah, good question. The answer to that is mostly that we don't know, because it's really hard to know if a whale is happy or not. And so the best we can do is sort of correlations with what they're doing at the time. And so we can say that this call seems to happen a lot when they're doing this. And we haven't, really come to see in a lot of, I'm speaking mostly for the baleen whales because that's what I know most about. We haven't really found evidence of distress calls or anything like that.
So just to follow up on that, and then I'm going to get to some of the questions here in the chat. Can you explain a little bit more what the difference is between humpback whale song and then other types of vocalization, in terms of just the humpback male whales singing as opposed to other types of communication?
Yeah, so in the 1970s, a team of researchers coined the term song to describe these complex patterned sequences of sounds that humpback whales were making. And the reason they called it song was because they found it similar to bird song, which has been much better studied. So if you go outside even today, you might hear these patterns of sounds that birds are making. And so that's where the term originated. And they later, with more thorough studies, found that it was only coming from males and didn't seem to be coming from females or females with calves. And so really the main difference is that it's this sequence, this pattern of sounds, also like human songs, where you've got notes in a row in a pattern that's sometimes repeated in different ways. Whereas calls might be more similar to words or phrases that we, in human terms, is they're usually on their own or in a much shorter sequence. And when we record them, a lot of times it can be kind of more chaotic than this patterned sequence that you can hear mostly on the breeding grounds, but elsewhere too.
Great, thank you.
Here's a question from one of the viewers, Zoom viewers. If whales take lungs full of air before a deep dive, do they suffer from the same issues as human deep divers? That the deeper they go, the more pressure on their lungs full of air increases? Or have their lungs evolved in a different way to human lungs, and so this issue is not a problem for them?
Yes to both of those. So they do suffer that problem, but their lungs have evolved they have adaptations to deal with that. So their lungs actually do compress, and the air compresses as they dive deep down. And some of the whales, especially the beaked whales, which I didn't really talk about here, dive to thousands of meters down, which is an insane depth that they go down and that they can hold their breath for. And so they have really specially adapted, the way that oxygen dissolves in their blood, and the way that their lungs work, and the way that they circulate air, because as you might know from talking, you need air in order to make sound. And so they make the sound inside of them and then have to release it into the water, and they're able to recycle that air inside of them. It's all really amazing and an active area of research is how these whales are able to dive so deep and maintain their bodies while they're under such extreme pressure.
So could you explain that a little more? Like, as I think of a human being has a larynx, a voice box, or whatever, that is enabling me to make sound right now. So what is it physically that is inside of a whale that's enabling them to make those sounds?
Good question. And we know that answer more for some of the toothed whales because we can keep them in captivity and study them better. For the baleen whales, there's a lot we don't know. We don't even know for sure how they're making sound because the most we get is necropsies, which is when you can dissect the whale when it washes up on shore. And so that's really different from seeing a live whale actually making sounds. That being said, they do have vocal cords or vocal folds the same way that we do. And across mammals, I mean, if you were to talk and feel, around your neck, you'll feel vibrations as the air is moving over those folds in certain ways. And so we assume that that's similar to what's happening in the whales, but then they need to somehow make the sound, instead of moving air particles, it needs to move water particles instead. So they need to have special organs in order to transmit from air into water. And so like I mentioned with the sperm whale, they have these fat sacs which help them to do that. And in the toothed whales, they have these phonic lips that they use to emit sounds, and then they can focus it through the fat in their forehead and emit it out that way and also receive it that way. Admittedly, I am not an anatomist or a physiologist, and so that's not something I know as much about, but there's also a lot that we don't know about it.
Over what kind of distance can whales communicate effectively underwater? With sounds of ships, propellers, etc., traveling underwater too, do they have the ability to filter out other sounds to concentrate on the one important to them? I.e., like what we would zone in on when a friend is talking to us amid multiple conversations going on in a busy and noisy room.
Yeah, great question. And so that varies a lot with how loud the sound they're making is and the environment, like they said in the question, depending on how much noise is around that will change how far the sound can travel and still be detectable. Sound loses energy as it travels from the source. So you can think of how if you were standing, I mean, I have a mic on, but if you're standing close to me, you would be able to hear it a lot better than farther away because it's losing energy. So it really depends, anywhere on the order of, a few hundred meters to a few hundred kilometers for some of those really loud, low frequency sounds. And in different parts of the ocean, sound can travel better. It gets very complicated. But in response to the part of the question about with all the noise around and sort of focusing in, a lot of animals seem to have the same sort of adaptations that we do. So you can think of if we were all talking right now at once, there would be a lot of noise going on, and it would probably be a little harder to focus on the person who's talking to you. And so the same would be true for the whales sending acoustic signals to each other. But they can also raise their voices. So if I wanted to yell to someone across the room over the noise of everyone talking, I could do that. So that is something known as the Lombard effect, which is where animals will increase how loud they're making sounds in order to be heard. But you can also imagine that that takes more energy. That's harder. You can't yell all the time. And similarly, you can also change the frequency at which you're communicating a little bit in order to leave the frequency range where a lot of that noise is. So for example, if there's a lot of low frequency noise, you can send out signals at a higher pitch so that they're more easily discernible because they're not in the midst of all that noise. But that's a lot harder because a lot of the frequency depends on sort of like the physical apparatus that we have in order to make sounds. But there is evidence of blue whale sounds getting lower and lower frequency, and there's also evidence of right whale upcalls changing frequency depending on the increase in noise levels.
So to follow up on that, I know you mentioned I believe they were snapping shrimp that can be heard underwater, and I know we were talking about this yesterday, that while snorkeling in Hawaii without any fancy equipment other than your own ears, you can actually hear whale calls while snorkeling, that it is able to travel in those waters.
Yeah, and the breeding grounds, there's often many, many males singing at the same time, and so it's a sort of chorusing, but it's not synced up. They're all singing different parts of the song at the same time. And you can hear that underwater. You can stick a hydrophone in and listen, or even just snorkeling over the reefs. If you get down and kind of like hold your breath for a minute, so you can hear the sounds of humpback whales singing.
Concerning whales and echolocation, when they have gone really deep, so it may be very dark, do they use this technique to help them locate food, other whales, and the lay of the land in a similar fashion to bats?
Yes. Yeah, and that's really interesting because, evolutionarily speaking, these unrelated species have come up with the same strategy to find, to figure out their environment and to find food. And so different species will use it in different ways, but in general, yes, it is a way to find other whales, navigate underwater, and find food.
Whales breathing, we can see the exhale blowing, but where do they inhale? Through the same blowhole? It doesn't seem like the blowhole is above the waterline long enough to inhale very much air.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And in some of these, yes, they're inhaling at the same time. They exhale and inhale at the surface. And in some cases, with drone footage or with some of these tags with cameras, we can see their nostrils or nares opening and closing and get a better idea. Because as you can imagine, sometimes you hold your nose when you go underwater so you don't get water up your nose. They have the ability to open and close their blowholes, which is essentially a nose migrated to the top of their head. And so we can see that happening and get a better idea of their breathing in and out, which is really cool because we can study energetics and how they're using oxygen.
With each whale and dolphin type making different sounds, would that be similar to humans having different languages? Does it seem as if different whales are able to communicate with other types of whales and dolphins?
Great question. Less like human languages in the sense that these are totally different species, but yes. And there is some research being done on interspecies like vocal recognition, so in different species of dolphin, whether they can hear another species of dolphin and be able to identify that that's not their species, it's another species. And so the way a lot of these experiments are done are with playbacks, where they'll play a sound to, like, say, a trained dolphin and ask it to respond, ask it like, is this, someone you know or someone you don't know, and then give them a reward when they answer the question. So that's how a lot of these studies are done. And there is a little bit, of research going on in that area. But in terms of sort of different languages, I think something that's really interesting is within species. So humans are all one species, right? Within species, we do have different dialects. And so there's, some killer whale pods use different calls than other killer whale pods in different parts of the world, or in the same part of the world. So for example, in the Pacific Northwest, there's 2 pods of killer whales that don't interbreed at all, and use totally different sounds to communicate. And that's true. Sperm whales have their different codas in different places. And coming back to humpback whale song, each population sings a different song, but they all sing relatively the same song. And then that song changes from year to year, almost like a pop song changing over time. So a long answer to that question is a lot we don't know, but also there is this remarkable variation that we see geographically and culturally.
That's a great question.
Do the whales have a vocabulary which increases with age, experience, or are they born with a vocabulary fully intact, formed, which remains the same for life? And does their voice sound change with age like a child would sound in relation to an aged adult?
Excellent question. That is my thesis research. And hopefully I'll have more answers for you soon, because I'm really interested in that. And so part of it, as a child changes with age, their physiology is changing, right? So their lungs get bigger and their body gets bigger and their larynx gets bigger. And so the same thing is happening with whales and other animals where they get bigger. And so often we think of, say, our voices get deeper as we age, as we get bigger. And so the same would happen with different animals. And so there's changes in their vocalizations as they age that come from their physiology changing. And then there's also the potential for learning. And I'm really interested in this idea of vocal learning, where animals can hear a sound that they've never heard before and learn to produce that sound themselves. And it's a very rare trait among animals. And so one of the questions is, do cetacean species have this ability, and what does that look like? Do they have a small repertoire when they're born? Do they have some innate sounds that then they're able to learn more and build on that? And that's sort of what we're trying to figure out.
Great. We've got a number of great questions that have come here in the chat. One comment there here, this is from a name you might recognize, Barbara Mayer. Thanks so much for a terrific presentation, Julia. It was wonderful to be your student today. You make all your former teachers very proud. So that's a Port Washington teacher who's joined the program today. Another comment here, great presentation. Do you have a favorite whale species?
Yeah, and my favorite whale species is humpbacks. Even though they're like kind of lame show-offs, that's also why I like them, is because they'll give you a show. They're the ones that are always jumping out of the water, and they make these crazy songs, and they're my focal species. So I always feel like it's kind of a lame answer, but they're cool.
Awesome. One more question here, and I think we'll start to wrap this up. Do whales love to sing like humans for the joy of singing, not for communicating?
No idea. That's a great question, and I guess maybe a little bit more of where the science question is there is, do they make certain songs because they find them more aesthetically pleasing? Is that why, more complex songs? And we don't know. We generally don't know in animals, if things have more of a adaptive functional significance or not. And so, yeah, the answer to that is we don't know. Great question. Maybe someday we'll be able to tell, but it's really hard to know if a whale is happy or joyful, for sure.
So I guess the one of the takeaways here is just a scientist's job is to keep asking questions.
Yes.
And then after that, ask more questions.
Yep. Always questions.
This sounds like a dumb question, but I just don't know. Can you hear whale sounds out of the water?
That is a great question, actually. Not a dumb question at all. And yes, depending on how loud the sound is. So there's this, the barrier between water and air means that because sound travels by particles vibrating. That's how sound travels. And so it means that not only do the water particles need to vibrate, but then you also need the air. So you need the energy to transfer from the water into the air. And so the answer is yes in some cases. So if you're very close to a whale, you might be able to hear it from above water. If it's underwater. The other thing that's really cool is when I've been out in Hawaii in particular, if you're right above a whale, the song sometimes can resonate with the hull of the boat. And so you can hear it through the hull of the boat. And that's one way that the sound kind of transmits into the air. But yeah, there's some complicated physics involved in how that works.
Yeah, another question.
I did a whale watch in Cape Cod a number of years ago. And this whale came close to the boat and raised its head, almost like it wanted to communicate with us. Is that possible?
Yeah, so a lot of whales are very curious. It seems like they, want to see what's going on. And there's this behavior that we've termed spy hopping, where the whale will just stick its head up out of the water and its eyes up out of the water and sort of look around. And it's been called spy hopping because that's kind of what it seems like they're doing to look around. But again, we don't know really what the whale is thinking at the time. But yeah, they seem to be very curious animals. Will come check out boats and see what's going on.
Question over here.
Great talk. Could you recommend any places on Long Island to go and see them, and any companies that specialize in this?
Yeah, great question. So there is a program through NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, called Whale Sense, and SENSE, and it has a list across different states of whale watch companies that have, you know, sort of passed the test of being, you know, ethical whale watch companies that don't harm animals. And I believe there are 3 whale watch companies listed under there, 2 in one in Manhattan, 1 in Queens, and 1 further out on Long Island. So I recommend checking that out and using some of those whale watch companies.
I've heard during whale watching, if the whale comes close enough to the boat, when they exhale and you're downwind, can you explain what that's like? And
Yeah.
what it smells?
Yes, it does smell. Whales have fishy breath. They have stinky breath. So you're getting, basically what's happening is the whale is breathing out. And I mean, if you think about in winter, when it's cold, you can see your breath because it's got moisture that's kind of condensing into this cloud. And so that's what's happening when the whale is breathing out, is we've got this condensing cloud of moist air that's coming from inside the whale. And so it smells bad. A lot of the time it smells like fish. And it definitely, you can drive your boat right through it sometimes. And you can feel kind of, you get a little bit of dampness. It can fog up your camera lens. It can be a little stinky. And I mean, we call it like getting whale snot on you. It does happen.
Well, I don't think we want to end on whale snot, so so one more comment here down at the bottom. Thank you, Julia. Wonderful presentation. And I've learned so much today. Thank you for an amazing talk. So let's have another round of applause for Julia Zay.
Thank you.
And looks like we have one more question.
Okay.
I'd just like to know, how long does it take for a baby whale to develop before it's
Ooh.
born?
Good question. And so the calves will stay with their moms, at least, again, I'm talking about Baleen, the large baleen whales. They will stay with their mom for the first year of their life. They're born on the breeding ground, migrate up to the feeding ground, and then usually come back to the breeding ground and eventually separate from the mom there. And then they're these juvenile animals, and I think in humpback whales at least, they reach sexual maturity between 5 and 10 years of age. But it's really hard to get good age estimates of that. And so that's something we're not sure, and especially in some of the other less well-studied species, we really don't know what age of sexual maturity, but it's a few years before they reach sexual maturity.
Terrific. Well, I think we're going to wind things up. Again, thanks, Julia, for a terrific presentation today. Your parents must be very proud of you. So I hope everybody has a terrific weekend. Hope to see you at some of our future programs. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.